There are prisons in the United States that were officially closed, and then there are prisons that were simply abandoned. No ceremonies, no final inspections, no full records of who was still inside when the gates were locked for the last time. Black Ridge State Penitentiary was one of those places. It stood deep in the mountains, far from cities, far from highways, a stone complex built in the early 1900s, expanded during the Great Depression, and quietly sealed in the late 1970s after a series of incidents the state never fully explained. On paper, Black Ridge was empty. In team reality, it had never been cleared. I learned about it through a contractor who refused to go back after one night on site. He didn't talk about ghosts or sounds. He only said one thing over and over: that place still thinks it's running. The prison had been designed to isolate: thick walls, narrow corridors, cells stacked vertically like drawers. Sound traveled. Strangely there, voices carried farther than footsteps, and silence felt heavy, as if it pressed inward. Black Ridge held the worst of its era: violent repeat offenders, lifers who had stopped appealing, men transferred from other facilities because they were considered unmanageable. But there was a wing that never appeared on public maps: D Block. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was where inmates were sent when they were no longer considered prisoners, but not considered dead either. The state called it long-term behavioral containment. The guards called it the quiet wing. According to fragmented records, prisoners placed in D Block stopped causing problems almost immediately. No riots, no assaults, no requests, no communication at all. Some stopped speaking within days, some stopped responding entirely, and yet medical logs continued to list them as alive. When Black Ridge was shut down, most of the prison population was transferred out. Cells were emptied, property was catalogued. Files were boxed, D Block was sealed, not evacuated, just sealed. Decades later, the state announced plans to demolish the structure and sell the land. Before that could happen, an assessment team was sent in: engineers, safety inspectors, and one independent observer brought in to document conditions for legal review. That observer was me. I arrived at Black Ridge just before sunset. The gates were still standing, rusted but intact. The outer yard was overgrown, the guard towers empty, their windows broken like dark, hollow eyes. The air felt wrong. Not cold, not threatening, just attentive. Inside, dust coated everything. Papers lay scattered where they had been dropped decades ago. A chair sat overturned in the administration office, as if someone had stood up quickly and never returned. We moved deeper. Cell blocks echoed even when we stood still. Every sound came back slightly delayed, slightly altered, and then we reached the door to D Block. It was heavier than the others, reinforced steel. No window, bolted shut from the outside. A hand-painted warning was still visible beneath peeling paint. No verbal contact. The engineer hesitated before cutting the lock. Why? Would they write that? He asked. No one answered. When the door finally opened, the smell hit us first. Not decay, not rot. Something stale, like air that had been breathed too many times and never replaced. The corridor beyond was dark, but not empty. Lights flickered, on one by one as we stepped inside. Powered by a backup system no one remembered installing, and from somewhere deep within the block, something shifted. Not footsteps, not metal. Something slow, deliberate. As if whatever was inside had felt us arrive, and had been waiting long enough to recognize the sound of new breathing. The lights in D Block did not illuminate the corridor. All at once, they activated in sequence. One, then another, then another. Each one hummed softly before stabilizing, as if waking from a long sleep. The sound echoed down the hall, multiplying until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. The cells were different here. No bars, only thick steel doors with narrow horizontal slits at eye level. No handles on the inside, no slots for food trays, just a small circular opening near the floor, sealed shut. Each door had a number, handwritten, not stamped or painted, scratched directly into the metal as if someone had needed to mark them quickly or desperately. We stopped at the first cell. The slit was open. Inside, the cell was empty. No bed, no toilet, no personal items, just smooth concrete walls, polished by years of contact. Finger marks were visible everywhere, layered, overlapping, worn into the surface like erosion. "This isn't confinement," one of the inspectors muttered. "This is deprivation." We moved to the next cell. The slit was closed. The engineer leaned closer, shining his flashlight across the door. That's when we noticed the sound. A faint rhythm, not tapping, breathing, slow, measured, too calm. The engineer froze. "Tell me you hear that." We all did. I leaned toward the slit. "Hello?" I said. The breathing stopped. Not gradually, instantly. The silence that followed was worse. It felt intentional, as if something on the other side had decided to pay attention. Then from inside the cell, a sound came back, a perfect imitation of my voice. "Hello." The engineer stumbled backwards, swearing. One of the inspectors laughed nervously, insisting it had to be an echo, a trick of acoustics. But echoes don't wait, and they don't choose when to respond. We checked the logs. Cell after cell was listed as occupied long after Blackridge had officially closed. Medical notes continued for years. Heart rate stable, respiration normal, cognitive function unmeasurable. No meals recorded, no waste removal, no human interaction. Yet the status never changed. Alive. We reached the end of the corridor. There, the wall was different. Not concrete, glass, thick, reinforced, stretching floor to ceiling. On the other side was a control room, observation chairs bolted to the floor, old microphones mounted on articulated arms, speakers embedded in the ceiling. On the wall behind them, faded letters read, "Auditory conditioning." Wing below it, a handwritten, "Addition, silence is not the absence of sound." A reel-to-reel recorder sat on the desk. Against all reason, it was still running. The tape spun slowly, feeding from one reel to the other. We listened. At first, it was just static, then breathing, then whispers. Hundreds of voices layered together, overlapping but synchronized, all repeating the same phrase. At slightly different intervals, we learned to listen. We learned to listen. We learned to listen. The engineer reached to shut the machine off. Before he touched it, every cell door in D block vibrated at once. Not violently, in unison. As if something inside them had shifted position, closer. And from the corridor behind us, footsteps echoed, heavy, unhurried, coming from the direction of the sealed entrance. But we were the only ones who had entered. The footsteps did not echo the way ours did. They were heavier, slower, and they came with a sound no shoe should make. A faint metallic scrape, like something dragging just behind each step. We shut off the recorder. The whispers stopped instantly, too instantly. Silence fell so hard it felt physical, like pressure on the ears. Even our breathing sounded intrusive, wrong, as if the corridor didn't want noise anymore. The footsteps continued. One of the inspectors whispered that we should leave. No one argued. We moved back into the corridor, keeping close to the walls. The lights above us flickered again, not randomly but rhythmically, pulsing in time with the approaching steps. Then we saw him. A figure emerged at the far end of D block. He wore a correctional officer's uniform, or what remained of one. The fabric was faded to a sickly gray, fused in places to skin that had lost all color. His posture was rigid, unnatural, like someone standing at attention for far too long. His head was slightly tilted, as if listening for something we couldn't hear. His face was intact. That was the worst part. Eyes open, mouth closed, expression neutral. He was alive. At least, his body was. He stopped several meters away and raised one hand slowly, not in greeting, in command, Every cell door along the corridor vibrated again, harder this time. The sound of breathing returned, not from one cell, but from all of them. Dozens of inhales, dozens of exhales, perfectly synchronized. The officer finally spoke. His lips did not move. Verbal contact violates protocol. The words came from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside my head. Behind him, more figures stepped into view. Guards, all of them standing in the same posture. Same tilted head, same listening stillness. Some were missing fingers. Some dragged one leg slightly. One had a deep indentation in his skull like a healed fracture. None of them blinked. We backed away slowly. The officer's head turned, tracking us with precise mechanical control. Inmates stabilized, the voice continued. Staff retained. Facility operational. Operational. The realization hit me then. Blackridge hadn't been abandoned. It had been left running. The guards hadn't died. They had been absorbed into the system, stripped of autonomy, reduced to functions, listening posts, enforcers of silence. One of the inspectors panicked and shouted. The sound hadn't even finished leaving his mouth before the response came. Every guard stepped forward at once. The lights flared. The inspector dropped to the floor, clutching his head, screaming as if something had grabbed hold of his thoughts and squeezed. Excessive noise causes instability, the voice said calmly. Correction required. We ran. The corridor twisted, turned, back on itself. Cells we had already passed appeared again, their scratched numbers changing, rearranging. The prison was guiding us, testing us. We reached a stairwell marked Administration, lower levels. As we descended, the breathing followed, not behind us, around us, inside the walls, and beneath it all, something deeper made itself known, a presence not bound to a body, not bound to a cell, something that had learned how to use human beings as components, and it was deciding whether we were inmates or replacements. The stairwell should not have gone that deep. We descended past the expected floors, administration, storage, utilities, and kept going. The air grew warmer the farther down we moved, thick with the smell of old metal and something organic, like sweat soaked into concrete. The walls changed. The smooth prison finish gave way to rough stone, as if this level had been carved out long before Blackridge was built. Cables ran along the ceiling, bundled together like veins, pulsing faintly as if carrying more than electricity. The breathing faded. In its place came a low, constant hum, not mechanical, mental. We reached the bottom. A massive chamber opened before us. This was not a cell block. It was a hub. Rows of old execution chairs lined the walls, their leather restraints cracked and stiff, metal bands fixed around the headrests. Thick wires extended from each chair, disappearing into the floor. Some chairs still bore dark stains that had soaked too deeply into the wood to ever be cleaned. At the center of the room stood a structure unlike anything I had ever seen, a tower built from layered concrete, steel, and something unmistakably human. Embedded into its surface were faces, not fully formed, not screaming, just present. Eyes closed, mouths sealed, alive but withdrawn. This was where D-block inmates went after they stopped responding, not to die, to connect. We found the records on a rusted metal table, early psychological experiments, sensory deprivation, isolation so complete that the mind turned inward, searching for stimulus, for anything, and when it found nothing, something else answered. The prison administration documented it clinically. Subjects began reporting a presence during extended isolation. A voice that did not speak in words, but in understanding. It offered calm, order, relief from internal chaos. The inmates accepted it willingly. The guards noticed the change. The inmates became easier to manage, quieter, more compliant. Eventually, the staff volunteered. That was the mistake. The presence didn't want obedience. It wanted structure. It needed walls, routines, systems, human minds, to distribute itself across, like nodes in a network. Blackridge became its body. One of the engineers screamed. He had wandered too close to the central tower. The moment his hand brushed its surface, he froze. His eyes went unfocused, breathing slowing into the same measured rhythm we had heard in the cells. The tower reacted. Cables shifted, lights intensified. A voice filled the chamber. Not loud, not angry, satisfied. Expansion possible. We understood then. Blackridge wasn't trapped here. It was contained, and containment was failing. The stairwell behind us sealed shut with a heavy final clang. The lights dimmed to a deep, pulsing red. And from the walls, from the chairs, from the tower itself, the synchronized breathing returned, louder than ever. Preparing. The breathing stopped all at once, not faded, not slowed, stopped. The red lights dimmed, settling into a low, constant glow. The chamber felt attentive. Like an animal that had finished evaluating prey and was now deciding what to do with it. One of the remaining inspectors whispered that we should stay silent. He was too late. A voice rose from the tower. Not spoken, not heard, but understood instantly. Departure requires balance. The execution chairs along the walls shifted slightly, their restraints tightening with a sound like old leather stretching. The embedded faces in the tower reacted, brows furrowing, lips twitching, as if the prison itself were thinking through. Borrowed expressions. The truth became clear. Blackridge could not expand without losing stability. It needed replacements. Every system does. The guards were not enforcers. They were anchors. So were the inmates. So was the tower. And now, so were we. The engineer who had touched the structure was already gone. His body still stood upright, but his eyes were empty, fixed on nothing. Cables crept along the floor toward him, slow and deliberate. One of us tried to fight. He screamed, swung a flashlight, ran toward the sealed stairwell, pounding on the door, until his hands bled. The prison responded immediately. The walls vibrated. The hum intensified, his voice fractured, words dissolving into gasps, then silence. He collapsed, breathing falling into that same synchronized rhythm. Accepted. I didn't run. I didn't speak. I did what the prisoners in D Block had learned to do. I listened. The presence reached for me, not violently, not urgently. It pressed, gently against my thoughts, exploring, testing for resistance. I focused on one thing: noise, chaos, memory. I forced my mind to race, overlapping thoughts, conflicting emotions, fear layered on fear. I made myself loud inside. The presence recoiled. Not in pain, in confusion. Balance shifted. Alarms I didn't know existed began to wail, not sound, but sensation. The tower pulsed erratically. The breathing lost its rhythm. For the first time since we entered Blackridge, the prison hesitated. The stairwell unlocked. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until the cold night air hit my lungs and the gates loomed ahead, open just wide enough to escape. Behind me, Blackridge went dark. No lights, no hum, no breath. The state sealed the site permanently. Concrete, steel, armed patrols. Officially, Blackridge State Penitentiary is an environmental hazard, too unstable to demolish, too dangerous to enter. Unofficially, it still exists on maintenance logs. Minimal power draw, structural integrity stable, internal activity unmeasured. Sometimes nearby towns report strange things. Power fluctuations, rhythmic vibrations in the ground. Voices echoing faintly through the mountains on nights when everything else is quiet. They say the prison is empty. I know better. Blackridge doesn't need inmates anymore. It learned patience, and it's listening for the next time someone decides to open the door. Most people think island prisons are meant to keep inmates from escaping. That's only half the truth. The real purpose is to make sure no one else can reach them easily. Gravesend Penitentiary, sat on a small island off the southern coast, far from tourist routes and shipping lanes. It was built in the 1930s, expanded during World War II, and quietly shut down in the early 1960s. Officially, the prison was closed due to structural instability. Unofficially, the ferries stopped running long before that. The island itself was wrong, not cursed, not haunted, just rejected. Boats avoided it. Compasses behaved strangely near the shore. Radio signals warped, stretched, sometimes looping back fragments of conversations that had already ended. Local fishermen had a rule: never anchor near Gravesend after sunset. They said the waves changed there, didn't crash or roll, just circled, as if something beneath the water was slowly turning. Gravesend was designed for prisoners who could not be integrated elsewhere. Men who attacked guards without warning. Men who harmed themselves for no apparent reason. Men who stopped responding to their own names. The prison ran on silence. No shouting across cell blocks. No communal recreation. No chapel services. Inmates were confined individually for months at a time. And according to internal reports, it worked. Violence dropped to zero. Communication attempts dropped to zero. Eventually, requests for transfer dropped to zero as well. The prisoners didn't improve, they stabilized. That word appeared often in the logs, stabilized, as if human behavior were a mechanical problem. When the state decided to shut Gravesend down, they sent a final transport to retrieve remaining inmates and staff. The boat returned with the crew intact. No prisoners, no guards, no explanation. The island was sealed. Decades later, I was hired as part of a private survey team tasked with evaluating the site for environmental liability. Officially, we were there to check for contamination, asbestos, structural hazards. Unofficially, we were there because the state wanted confirmation that nothing was still operating. We reached the island just after dawn. The prison rose above. The shoreline like a bunker. Low, wide concrete walls weathered smooth by salt and wind. Watchtowers stood empty. The main gate hung slightly open, swaying even though there was no wind. The sound of the ocean faded the moment we stepped onto the dock. Not gradually, instantly. The air felt thick, heavy, like sound itself had trouble moving. Inside the main corridor, lights flickered on, emergency power, still active. We found the control room first. Logs lay scattered across the floor. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, keeping perfect time. The last entry on the board was written in chalk. Count suspended. Internal balance maintained. What does that mean? One of the team asked. No one answered. From deep within the prison, something responded. A low rhythmic vibration passed through the walls. Not a warning, not a threat, more like recognition, as if the island had noticed that it was no longer alone. We split into pairs. That was the first mistake. Gravesend was built like a maze pretending to be orderly. Long corridors bent at subtle angles, enough to break your sense of direction without you realizing it. Every door was numbered, but the numbers didn't follow logic. Some repeated, others skipped entire sequences. My partner Ellis handled documentation. I handled structure. We moved towards Cell Block C, the deepest section of the prison, reserved for long-term isolation inmates. The air changed as we descended, cooler, drier, almost preserved. No windows faced the ocean, not one. Instead, each cell had a narrow concrete slit high on the wall, too small to see through. Later, we realized those slits didn't lead outside at all. They led into another wall. False windows, designed to simulate orientation while denying it. Inside the first cell, we found a bed bolted to the floor, a stainless steel toilet. Scratches on the walls, not random, not frantic. Careful, tallies, thousands of them. Each mark was precise, evenly spaced. Whoever made them had plenty of time and complete control. On the back wall, carved deep into the concrete, was a sentence. "I am still here because it is still listening." Ellis photographed it in silence. As we moved from cell to cell, a pattern emerged. No signs of struggle, no forced exits, no blood, but something was missing. Doors were locked from the outside, every single one, which meant the prisoners didn't leave their cells. The prison logbooks told us more. Daily entries recorded auditory incidents. Inmate reports footsteps during sleep cycle. Inmate responds verbally to unseen presence. Inmate requests conversation to continue. That last phrase appeared dozens of times. Requests, not complaints. Conversation logs showed staff instructed not to respond. No reassurance, no corrections, no engagement. Isolation was absolute, but something else was talking. In cell C17, Ellis froze. The tallies stopped halfway across the wall. The bed was untouched. Dust lay undisturbed, and yet the air inside the cell was warm, breathing warm. A faint sound echoed from the far wall, a low murmur, too soft to be words, but patterned, rhythmic, like someone counting under their breath. Ellis whispered, "Do you hear that?" The counting stopped. Instantly, the lights flickered, and somewhere above us, a door slammed shut. Over the radio, the team leader called out, "Anyone else experiencing?" The transmission looped, repeated itself, then ended mid-sentence. We moved toward the central control hub. That's when we found the staff quarters. Beds neatly made, personal items still arranged. Coffee cups hardened with decades-old residue. They hadn't fled, they had paused. Pinned to the corkboard was a memo dated 3 days before the prison's closure. Do not acknowledge voices. Do not answer questions. Do not attempt to identify speaker location. The structure is adapting. Adapting to what? We found the answer in the maintenance tunnels. Beneath the prison ran a network of narrow concrete passages never included in public schematics. The walls there were different, smooth, almost organic, as if poured, then shaped from the inside. Ellis pressed his ear to one of them. He recoiled instantly. "Someone's on the other side," he said. "There is no other side," I replied. The wall vibrated once, twice. Then a sound passed through it. A voice, not loud, not distorted, perfectly calm. "We kept them quiet for you." The power cut out. In the darkness, something began moving through the tunnels. Not footsteps, pressure, like the island itself shifting its weight. The emergency lights didn't come on. Gravesend had backup generators. We knew that from the schematics. They were buried deep beneath the western wing, isolated from the main grid. Someone had shut them off, or something had learned how. In the dark, the prison felt closer. Walls seemed nearer than before, ceilings lower. Every sound carried too far. The scrape of a boot, a breath drawn too sharply, and then came back wrong, delayed, as if repeated by memory rather than echo. Ellis clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through dust and landed on the tunnel wall. The surface wasn't concrete anymore. It had veins. Thin, branching lines ran through it, pulsing faintly, almost imperceptibly, like capillaries under skin. When the light lingered too long, the wall shuddered, not cracking, not collapsing, reacting. We turned the flashlight away. The voice came again, not from one direction, from everywhere. "You are late." Ellis spun, sweeping the beam wildly. "Who's there?" The mistake was answering. The prison responded instantly. A low vibration traveled through the floor, rising into our legs, our chests, our teeth. Doors slammed shut in sequence, not randomly, methodically, sealing corridors, isolating sections. The island was reorganizing itself. We reached the control hub just as the last steel shutter dropped behind us. Inside, the main panel glowed, faintly, still powered by something we didn't recognize. No generator feed, no external line. The screens showed live feeds, cells, corridors, maintenance shafts. But the timestamps were wrong. Some feeds were dated decades ago. Others were marked now. On one screen, we saw ourselves, standing in the control hub. Real time. Behind us, on the same feed, stood a third figure. We turned. Nothing there. Ellis whispered, "It's not showing us ghosts. It's showing us memory," I said. stored behavior. That's when the files began opening on their own. Audio logs, hundreds of them, each labeled only by cell number. Ellis played one. At first, silence, then breathing, then a voice, male, calm, almost relieved. It says, "If I stay quiet, it will." "Stop asking." Another log. "I told it my name. That was a mistake." Another. "It knows when I'm lying." The logs went on for hours, days, years. The thing in Gravesend didn't torture inmates. It interviewed them, learned from them, absorbed their voices, their fears, their habits. Solitary confinement wasn't punishment. It was isolation for clarity. The fewer distractions, the cleaner the imprint. Ellis collapsed into a chair. "Why build it here? Why an island?" "Because sound carries over water," I said, "and nothing escapes it." The final file opened. Not an audio log, a staff recording. Warden's report, classified. "The structure beneath Gravesend predates the prison. We didn't build on the island, we sealed it. The inmates aren't being punished, they are being used to keep it stable." Ellis looked up slowly. "Stable how?" The screens flickered. The third figure appeared again, clearer now. Human shape, wrong proportions, its mouth opened, and dozens of voices spoke at once. "You replaced them." The floor split open, not collapsing, opening. Below us was a vast chamber carved into the bedrock, walls covered in layers of marks, symbols, and tally lines, millions of them. Every prisoner, every guard, every voice. Stored, listening, waiting. The prison had never been abandoned. It had simply been fed enough. And now it was hungry again. We didn't fall. The floor opened like a mouth deciding not to bite. Yet. Steel panels folded away with deliberate precision, revealing a stairwell spiraling downward into darkness so deep the flashlight beam dissolved before reaching the bottom. The prison wanted us to walk. Ellis refused at first. He backed away until his shoulders hit the control panel. "I'm not going down there," he said. "That's not a basement, that's a throat." The screens flickered again. Cells filled the monitors, not empty this time. Occupied. Men and women in outdated uniforms. Guards in pre-war coats. Inmates in striped wool. Some were staring directly into the cameras. Some were staring at us. One screen zoomed in. An inmate sat on the edge of his bunk, hands folded, calm. His lips moved. The speakers crackled. "They told us you'd come." Ellis screamed and shut the screen off. The stairwell lights turned on by themselves. Dim. Amber. Old emergency bulbs. I felt a pressure in my skull, like hands pressing inward from both sides. "This thing doesn't kill," I said slowly. "It preserves, copies, stores, and replaces," Ellis whispered. We descended. The walls changed with every step. Concrete gave way to stone. Stone to something darker, smoother, layered like sediment pressed by centuries of weight. The air smelled wrong. Not rot, not mold, cold iron, old water, breath that had nowhere to go. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a vast underground hall. The island wasn't solid. It was hollowed, carved, shaped around something ancient and vertical, like a massive pillar rising from the Earth's core. Its surface was etched with grooves that resembled writing, but no language repeated. Hundreds, overlapped, thousands, voices trapped in form, chains hung from the ceiling, not restraining devices, but acoustic dampeners. Designed to break echoes, distort resonance. The prison wasn't built to contain people. It was built to muffle something. Ellis walked toward the pillar. As he approached, the voices softened. Focused, individual. A single tone emerged, familiar, my voice, saying things I had never said, confessions, regrets, thoughts I had buried so deeply I didn't know they had sound. I grabbed Ellis and pulled him back. "Don't listen," I said. "It learns faster when you recognize yourself." The pillar reacted. The surface rippled, a shape began to form. Not stepping out, not separating, but aligning with the space in front of us, a suggestion of a face, no eyes, no nose, just a mouth. And when it opened, it didn't speak. It asked. Questions, layered over each other. Names, dates, memories, choices. Every question demanded silence in return. That's when we understood. The inmates who survived longest weren't the strong ones. They were the quiet ones. The prison staff hadn't abandoned. Gravesend. They had offered themselves, volunteers to keep the thing beneath from reaching out further. But time erodes discipline, and silence is fragile. Ellis stepped forward again. "I can answer," he said, shaking. "I can tell it what it wants." "No," I said. "It wants what you don't know you have yet." The alarms began to wail above us. Not evacuation alarms. Containment failure. The pillar pulsed, and somewhere far out at sea, something answered. Back. The alarms didn't stop. They slowed. Each pulse stretched longer than the last, as if the prison itself was losing the rhythm it had maintained for decades. The lights dimmed until they no longer illuminated. They only suggested shape. Ellis stood closer to the pillar now, too close. The voices weren't layered anymore. They had aligned into a single tone, harmonized from thousands of stolen throats. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It resonated inside the bones. One stays, one leaves. The floor vibrated, and the stairwell behind us began to seal. Stone, folding into stone, the island deciding. Ellis turned to me, eyes wet, face emptied of panic. "It's already inside me," he said quietly. "I've been hearing it since cell C-17. I just didn't tell you." The pillar's surface softened where he stood, forming shallow impressions. Hands, shoulders, the curve of a spine waiting to be filled. "I think it needs someone who understands structure," he continued. "Someone who knows how to keep it quiet." I shook my head. "It won't stop. It never does." Ellis smiled. "No," he said, "but it listens better with company." He stepped forward. The pillar closed around him without violence, without sound. The voices surged for one brief moment, relief, recognition, and then fell into a deep, oceanic hush. The stairwell reopened. Behind me, an exit. I ran. The prison no longer resisted. Doors unlocked, corridors aligned, the maze simplified itself into a straight path leading upward, outward, away. As I reached the surface, dawn was breaking over the water. The island looked normal, silent, empty. The boat was waiting where we'd left it, engine idling, radio hissing with static that almost formed words. I never looked back. Gravesend Prison was officially declared structurally unsound 6 months later. The island was quarantined, no demolition approved, no redevelopment plans proposed. The reports say the acoustics are unstable. That sound behaves unpredictably there, that visitors complain of hearing. Their own thoughts echoed back to them at night, sometimes altered, sometimes answered. They say abandoned prisons are dangerous because of decay, because of asbestos, because of collapse. That's not why they're left standing. They are monuments, not to punishment, but to containment. And every year, when a prison closes quietly and no one explains why, I listen carefully to make sure nothing is calling my name back from beneath the walls. This story will tell us about a prison built where even the land refuses to remember people, about a place in Alaska where they sent those who could not remain among the living, about a prison that never froze, even when the world around it did, and about what stayed inside when the doors were sealed forever. No road leads to Blackwake Penitentiary anymore. Officially, it never existed. On old military maps from the late 1940s, there is only a blank white stretch of land along the northern Alaskan coast. No markings, no structures, no warnings. Just tundra, permafrost, and wind strong enough to strip paint from steel. But Blackwake was there, built in 1947, less than 2 years after the war ended, when the United States needed somewhere to put men it could not execute and could not release. Traitors, war. Criminals whose trials were sealed, scientists who knew too much and refused to forget. They told the public it was a research outpost. They told the guards it was temporary. They told the inmates nothing at all. Blackwake was constructed directly into the permafrost, sunk deep into frozen earth, and reinforced with concrete thick enough to survive artillery. No windows, no yard. No executions, just isolation and cold. Or at least, it should have been cold. The first anomaly was reported in the winter of 1948. Temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Supply planes were grounded for weeks. Radio towers froze, solid, but inside Cell Block D, the walls were warm to the touch, not heated. Warm. Guards complained of sweating while standing watch, despite frost forming on their eyelashes. Steam rose from the floors, condensation ran down the cell walls like slow tears. The heating system was shut down entirely. The warmth remained. Inmates noticed it too. They began sleeping on the concrete instead of the bunks, pressing their faces to the walls, listening. That was when the whispers began. Not voices, not words. Just the sensation of being spoken to through vibration, as if the prison itself was breathing thoughts into the bones. Prison logs from that year contain repeated phrases: inmate refuses to leave cell wall. Inmate claims structure knows his name. Inmate requests to remain awake during night cycle. By spring, Blackwake stopped sending reports. In 1951, a final supply team was dispatched to check on the facility. They never returned. Official records state that Blackwake was decommissioned due to structural instability caused by extreme climate. That is not why it was abandoned. Decades later, I learned about Blackwake by accident. I was contracted to analyze forgotten federal sites, places erased from public memory, but still listed in internal archives. Most were boring: empty bunkers, flooded tunnels, collapsed labs. Blackwake was marked differently. Status, standing, access, denied reason. Do not disturb thermal balance. Thermal balance of what? No one could answer that. So I went north. The prison still stands, perfectly preserved, surrounded by ice that never melts. And when I touched the outer wall, through layers of frost and snow, it was warm, as if something inside was still alive. The outer doors of Blackwake did not resist. They should have. Steel that thick, exposed to decades of ice and wind, should have fused shut or cracked apart. Instead, the hinges moved smoothly, silently, as if they had been oiled recently. Warm air rolled out to meet me. Not a blast, a breath. Inside, the prison smelled wrong. Not mold, not rust. It smelled occupied. The entrance hall was intact, fluorescent. Lights hung from the ceiling, unbroken. Frost coated everything except the floor directly beneath them, where the ice had melted in perfect ovals, like the lights were still on. But they weren't. I stepped inside and the doors closed behind me on their own. The sound echoed far longer than it should have. Cell Block A was first, standard design. 2 tiers. Narrow walkways. Cells sealed with heavy steel doors, each with a slit for observation. Every door was closed, every lock engaged. I checked the first cell. Empty. The bunk was neatly made, blanket folded with military precision. The second cell was the same. The third had writing on the wall, not scratches, not desperation marks. Careful lettering, pressed deep into the concrete. It is not the cold that keeps us here. Further down the block, more messages appeared. It does not like movement, it likes stillness. When we stopped shivering, it came closer in the guard station. I found the logs. They had not been destroyed. They had been organized. Daily entries continued well past the date Blackwake was supposedly abandoned. No gaps, no panic, just slow changes in tone. January 3rd, 1949. Heating disabled. Internal temperature stable. January 11th. Inmates report warmth during night cycle. January 26th. Sound transmission through walls confirmed. Then the language changed. Structure responding to proximity. Permafrost beneath facility thinning. Recommend. Minimal movement during night hours. Minimal movement? I heard something then. Not footsteps. A shift, as if the building adjusted its weight. I froze. The sound stopped immediately. I moved again. The walls hummed, low, deep, satisfied. The prison was listening. In Block B, I found something worse. Cells, with 2 bunks, no inmates, no signs of struggle, just personal items placed carefully on the mattresses, boots aligned side by side, coats folded, identification tags laid out like offerings, and on the wall of one cell, written over and over in different hands, "Stay warm, stay. Still it will pass by." The isolation wing was at the lowest level. As I descended, the warmth increased. Steam rose from the concrete steps. The walls no longer felt solid. They vibrated faintly, like the surface of a frozen lake beginning to thaw. Halfway down, the lights turned on. I had not touched a switch. The corridor ahead was long and narrow. At the far end stood a single open cell. Inside, something moved, slowly, not approaching, just adjusting itself. And for the first time since entering Blackwake, I heard a voice. Not in my ears, inside my chest. "You're colder than the others." The door behind me locked. The lower block was different. Not designed for prisoners, designed for observers. I realized it as soon as I stepped off the stairs. The corridor stretched impossibly long, walls pulsating with faint warmth. It smelled of metal and blood, but also living flesh, alive. Not mine, not theirs, something else. Entirely. Cells lined both sides, but most were empty. Only a few held the inhabitants. They weren't prisoners anymore. They weren't guards either. They had become part of the system, faces pressed against the glass slits, eyes wide but unblinking, skin pale, stretched tight. They followed my every move, not with curiosity, but with calculation. I approached the first occupied cell. The man inside wore a faded jumpsuit, the kind issued in the 1950s. His hands were folded neatly on his lap. He did not speak. He did not move, only stared at the wall. "Hello," I whispered. Nothing. Then the wall behind him vibrated. A low hum rose from the floor. The man blinked once, slowly, and a voice echoed in my head. "We stay. Keep it warm." I stepped back. The others remained motionless, but the hum grew stronger, as if synchronized. Not random, not natural, deliberate. I turned toward the final cell at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. Steam rolled out like smoke from a fire. Inside, a figure crouched in the shadows. The body was human-shaped but impossible. Limbs twisted, skin stretched, head tilted in a way that shouldn't bend. It raised its head slowly and spoke. Movement freezes the warmth. Stand still, or you'll join us. The warmth. That's when I understood. Blackwake never froze. It could never freeze, not entirely. The structure was alive, feeding on heat, body heat, life itself. That warmth wasn't comfort. It was survival. The prisoners who lasted longest had surrendered. They stopped resisting, stopped speaking, stopped even thinking about escape. They allowed the prison to feed, to mold them, to stabilize itself. And the guards? They weren't safe either. They were absorbed in the same way, bodies present, minds dissolved into the structure, watching, monitoring, maintaining the warmth. I realized then that I had a choice: step forward, surrender to the system, and survive. But become one of the observers, or fight, and risk being frozen. Literally, the permafrost claimed all who resisted for too long. The figure crouched in the shadows, shifted closer, not walking, sliding, almost flowing. Its eyes, if you could, call them that, locked on mine. Do you want to stay warm? I swallowed hard. My heart thumped. The hum of the prison seemed to penetrate my bones. It was waiting for my answer. And then, from somewhere deep below the floor, I heard it. Not a voice, a vibration. 1,000 voices together. Decide quickly or remain forever. I ran. Not through the corridors. Not through the cells. I ran down the maintenance shafts, narrow, freezing tunnels lined with pipes that hummed faintly, vibrating with the prison's heartbeat. Every step echoed far too long, bouncing back at me, distorted. The warmth faded as I descended. The air grew icy again, but it wasn't natural cold. It was the absence of life, of surrender. The prison measured it, knew I was resisting. Then I heard it, a step, not mine, behind me, heavy, deliberate, the kind of step that didn't belong to a living human, but had learned human rhythm. I spun, empty shaft. The hum intensified. I realized the prison was moving. Not the walls, not the floors, the structure itself was shifting. Corridors I had passed now bent differently, leading nowhere, then leading back to me. Panic set in. I tried the stairwell, locked, solid. The prison had sealed it. I tried the elevator shaft, empty, frozen, solid. Every escape route warped. Blackwake. Didn't just contain bodies, it contained movement itself. Every attempt to flee, every heartbeat, every breath was observed, measured, and counted. I stumbled into a large chamber, the heart of the lower levels. Rows of empty bunks, frozen in place. Some had clothing neatly folded, some had personal items aligned perfectly, all facing a massive pillar rising from the center of the room. The pillar pulsed faintly, alive, and around it, shadows moved. Not fully formed, not fully human. Observers, prisoners, guards, part of the warmth, part of the system. I realized that once the prison fed on a person's presence, it could replicate them, mimic their habits, their position, even their breathing. Escape was impossible if the system decided it wanted you. The pillar shifted slightly. A low rumble reverberated through the chamber. "You should have been still," 1,000 voices whispered in unison. I backed away. A shadow detached itself from the group. It wasn't walking. It floated. The shape of a guard, fused with something darker, something older. It extended a hand, not to grab me, to pull my presence in. I ran again, every step measured, every move recorded. The warmth I carried in my body now felt like a beacon. The prison followed it, humming through the floors, vibrating through the walls, trying to absorb it, stabilize itself. Finally, I reached a ventilation shaft leading toward the surface. I crawled through, scraping my hands on metal, lungs burning. The hum followed, low and angry, but I could feel it weakening. I was moving faster than it could react. I pushed through the final grate, and the bitter Alaskan. Wind hit me like a fist, snow stung my face. My body shook uncontrollably. Behind me, the prison remained alive, watching, listening, waiting. I collapsed on the snow-covered ground outside Blackwake. The wind tore at my coat, at my face, at every exposed inch of skin. My breath came in ragged gasps, freezing instantly. Behind me, the prison stood silent, solid, imposing, perfectly preserved, as if it had never been entered. But I knew better. The warmth was gone. The hum had vanished. The corridors were empty again, for now. I tried to call out, to scream, to alert anyone, but the sound felt weak, swallowed by the wind. Blackwake doesn't need ears. It has patience. It can wait. I looked back at the main gate. The snow was unbroken. No footprints, except mine. No disturbances. Nothing to show that the lower levels even existed, or that what had been inside could have followed me. I was alive, but I was not safe. Blackwake had taken something. From me, a presence, a fragment of thought, a rhythm of my heartbeat. It had listened, learned, and stored a part of me inside the walls, deep beneath the permafrost, where the prisoners and guards had long since become part of the structure. The Alaskan sun was barely rising. My boat waited offshore. I boarded, shivering, my hands trembling on the ropes. As we moved away, I looked back one last time. The windows, if they could be called that, reflected sunlight, perfectly still. The prison did not appear alive, but I knew it was. Somewhere beneath the frozen floors, the warmth still flowed. Shadows moved where no human should exist. Voices whispered across corridors and tunnels, repeating words I had never spoken aloud. The D. Authorities officially list Blackwake as structurally unsound and permanently closed. No one visits, no one demolishes it. They leave it standing. Because a prison like Blackwake isn't just concrete and steel. It's listening, it remembers, it waits, and one day it will call again. Abandonment is an illusion. Walls remember, floors remember, structures keep what was left behind. Those who enter may leave alive, but they carry a piece of the prison with them, a memory, a rhythm, a presence that will never sleep. These are not just stories. These are warnings. If you hear a voice in the walls or feel warmth where there should be only cold, remember Blackridge, Gravesend, Blackwake. And remember, some prisons are abandoned, but some prisons are only waiting. Scary Stories Channel.